The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Danish Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you had a good week. There's a lot of continued excitement coming out of Germany for obvious reasons. A firm statement has come out from the coalition of what they'd like to do in relation to cannabis legalization. However, it's still quite light on details, so it's quite hard to estimate timescales at the moment. With that in mind, I'm actually pulling together a panel of German experts to discuss what's on the table and how and when it might roll out. So that should be out in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, I've got a great episode coming up. One of the 3 that I recorded in Denmark. I'm a huge fan of the QNTM Labs guys, Justin and Connor. I really love the approach that they're taking. They're very thorough, but very open to learning and collaboration, which is obviously very important to me. Plus, they looked after us very nicely when we were in Copenhagen, so I'm very grateful for that. As ever, if you're an early stage business looking to raise investment, please do get in touch. Would love to see if we can help you. Now, on with this week's episode. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Justin Ihnken and Connor Murphy from QNTM Labs. QNTM is a full-service cannabis testing and analysis lab based in Denmark. Guys, welcome.
Hello, Anuj. How are you?
Thank you, Anuj. Happy to be here.
No, I'm happy to be here. You're hosting me in Denmark. This is lovely. Cannabis Conversation on tour.
Exactly.
How are you guys today?
Doing well. It's not raining here in Denmark, so it's a good day. It's already off to a good day.
Yeah.
Coffee and
Not bad. We're starting to get on the other side of the pandemic, so it's nice to have some visitors in. We had a small local symposium here in Denmark earlier, so it was nice to get the industry together.
Yeah, no, it was good fun. We are going to talk about your business though today, which is great. So let's start where we usually start. A bit about yourselves personally. Justin, you want to kick off?
Sure. Yeah, like you said, my name is Justin Ihnken. I am one of the co-founders here with Connor of QNTM. Originally, as I'm sure, my accent is not Danish, so I'm not from Denmark. I moved to Denmark about 4 years ago. In the process, have been able to really identify a big, lack in the industry for really quality research testing. We'll get into that later, but yeah, my background is in finance and economics. I moved here from the US, so
cool.
Excited to be on the show.
Yeah, no, great. And I always ask the question, how did you find that jump from big corporate to the crazy wild west of cannabis?
I think it's a lot of things, right? You very quickly become desensitized to, the big world of whether corporate finance or just big, huge commercial companies. And, I had an incredible kind of career change. But, having a background in finance, working for huge companies, you really start to, in a way, maybe lose sight of, day-to-day operations and really holding on to something tangible because, there's such big industries and, operations. So I wanted to change, wanted to find something new. And, coming from 2 parents that were entrepreneurs in the entrepreneurial space, I've had that itch for a while. So.
Good. Well, we'll find out more about QNTM in a minute. Connor, do you want to do your bit first?
Yeah, definitely. My name's Connor Murphy. I'm a co-founder of QNTM Labs, just like Justin. As your listeners can probably hear on the voice as well, it's not too thick with the Scandinavian accent. I was born and raised in the US as well. On the East Coast, New Jersey, but then spent quite a few years in San Francisco. I was working in tech investment banking, had a good time out there. But about 2 years ago, I moved over to Denmark and to Copenhagen. I'm actually half Danish. So my mother is from Denmark. About half my family is from here. So kind of got the urge to get back to my roots and see what things were like over here. Stayed in the finance world when I was first coming over. Then linked up with Justin, and we were both, as you mentioned, had that kind of entrepreneurial itch, wanted to get our hands around things and kind of do something for ourselves. And that's where we got introduced to the cannabis market here in Denmark.
Yeah. And did you encounter any sort of stigma, or were you worried about it when you first thought about jumping in, maybe family, friends, or anything like that?
No, is the quick answer. And, as I mentioned, I was in San Francisco before I moved to Denmark, and I was in San Francisco for a few years before the recreational market really came to fruition, and then a few years after. And so, I saw it when it was quasi-medical, and then I saw all the industry that was popping up when the rec market became fully legal. And so I was pretty fascinated by it. I never thought of myself really getting into it, but I saw a lot of people really working hard, and I saw the industry really become more legitimate in terms of just, all these ancillary businesses popping up and whatnot. So when I moved to Denmark and we kind of got introduced that there was a framework out here for cannabis, I almost felt like, ooh, this is definitely exciting. seeing a state of the market, kind of felt like a second bite at the apple. There's a lot of opportunity. I clearly knew that. I saw that. We really thought it could be a fun place to be. And so, a painful twist of irony, I moved to Denmark from San Francisco to become, an entrepreneur in the cannabis space.
Yes, I get the irony there. And I mean, obviously we just had this symposium yesterday, so it's worth sort of mentioning the kind of, not necessarily the unique, but like the strong points that Denmark has to offer this industry. What are you guys seeing as?
Yeah, I think when you look at the cannabis industry, at least globally, right, there is a clear, and it's a common message sent by all participants, that there's a clear lack of the research, right? There's a lot of research that does exist, but from a credibility perspective, for one reason or another, that it is inhibited for being used in, more formal regulatory support in various cases. So I think when we first, came to Denmark, you realize that, well, Denmark is very much a pharmaceutical hub. There's a lot of innovative, whether it be on the academia side or whether it be on the company side, startups in the pharmaceutical industry. And then combine that with the, long history of really agricultural excellence that Denmark does bring, intertwined with, whether it be technologies, robotics, things like that. So really pushing that industry forward was something that was already happening. So then when you layer an industry like cannabis, where it is both on the plant touching side, but also on the pharmaceutical research side, which is that lens that Europe brings, it really, that marriage between the two of cannabis kind of in all external eyes outside of Denmark. So wow, that really makes a lot of sense. And only more recently has it been really reinforced as a long-term production hub of Europe. And I think there's a lot of, not just us, but a lot of other companies promoting it and supporting that idea and that thought process.
Yeah, no, I think one thing that I took away from yesterday's symposium was just how high regard is placed on the high standards. And, that emanates from the kind of really strong pharma background that exists here in Denmark. And we are actually today in a town called Odense. Did I pronounce that right? Which is a couple of hours outside Copenhagen, but is a bit of a hub for cannabis companies in Denmark.
Yeah, that's right. Odense, or, spelled Odense, I guess you could say, is about an hour and a half, hour 45 minutes from Copenhagen. It's on the center island called Fyn, which is a agricultural hub and a hub of robotics now. And there's actually quite a bit of industry and innovation going on. It's kind of becoming a cluster of clusters, if you will, with, robotics, drone technology, some, greenhouse agriculture, now cannabis at that. And so there's a few fully GMP licensed producers and operators here in Denmark, and the majority of them are actually based within, just a few kilometers around the city of Odense. So it's a pretty nice place to be, when your fellow colleagues in the industry are just a, 20-minute drive down the road.
Yeah, that's nice. It's nice to have that kind of hub because everyone's learning at the same time, so you can share a lot of stuff there. Cool. So let's move on and talk a bit about Quantum. You're a relatively new company, but why don't you tell us what you do?
Yeah, sure. I guess I could just give a bit about, the story of Quantum and, when we started the company, which was from an ideation perspective, the end of 2019, then formally registering the company in the beginning of 2020. We, really identified that there is a clear need of, call it redefinition of pharmaceutical testing standards for a product that really is being put into a pharmaceutical box. And then that's the cannabis industry, right? So identifying that the laboratories really of yesterday are not, I don't want to say they're not able, but they're not as sufficient or as efficient as they should be for the pharmaceuticals of tomorrow. So I think if you kind of put it in that lens, there's a lot of redefinition and a lot of discussions that needs to be had at the table with politicians, regulators, doctors, and ultimately product producers so that they can adhere to standards. And one of the great reasons why we identified Denmark was that because Denmark already takes a very, very high standard to pharmaceuticals, not only cannabis, but, pharmaceuticals across the board, they hold them to a very high standard. So identifying that there's a real need was the driver behind saying there's a real opportunity to build a state-of-the-art cannabis laboratory for testing, analysis, and research. I'll let Connor kind of define what that means a little bit and what else we do and really what we focus on.
Yeah, definitely. And so when Justin kind of gave some of the backstory there, you say why we get into that and talk about Denmark a little bit. And I mentioned before, there's a ton of production here of, pharmaceutical grade cannabis-based products. And, one of the things we kept hearing over and over again is, well, all these operators are investing quite a bit into build out this production. One of the largest bottlenecks that they're facing is specifically in just access to testing and analysis, right? While labs, have the current, contract testing labs might have the capability to, process some cannabis-based samples, they don't do it well. They might not have the right take, the right competence, the right configuration of their workflows. And all in all, it was turned out to be one of the largest bottlenecks in the upstart and still today of the cannabis production industry here in Denmark. And it's one that you hear across markets around the world. And so, our thesis, okay, how do we bring better access to testing to these producers in the pharmaceutical based cannabis environment in Denmark? You hear a lot about in North America how, testing is kind of a race to the bottom. You hear a lot of these different aspects where, people are just trying to shop around and get results and stuff like that. But a key difference in the market, which we can touch into a little bit more, is the pharmaceutical setting of it, right? The producers aren't just, aren't just looking to get analysis results to check a box. Throughout the entire product development lifecycle, they need to leverage analysis to make sure, and figure out how they're deciding to do their formulations and then ultimately get their products released and adhere to the quality control standards, then make sure that they're stable going forward. And so that was something that we really thought we were really able to come to see, is that these cannabis producers in the pharmaceutical environment, even more so, need a lot of help and not hand-holding, but a sparring partner and someone that they can work with day in and day out to really understand, what is the right analysis, how to best look and develop their products going forward. And so that's really what the focus and the approach that we're taking with Quantum is, to really bring the contract laboratory or the testing and analysis, right across the table from, or as close and back to the producers as possible.
Yeah.
I guess what that meant was actively pursuing the conversations and asking the blunt questions of, where are you struggling when it comes to lab testing? What would make your life easier for lab testing? Where do you find your bottlenecks and roadblocks? And if in a perfect world you had a laboratory that could play every role you needed, what does that look like? Help us paint your picture so that we can fill the gap. Because again, we didn't come from the background. And, when you eat, sleep, and breathe the cannabis industry for, now going on 2 years, it's like, okay, I think we have a scratch of the surface of understanding and how the value chain works. But ultimately, it was the producers themselves and the doctors themselves and the regulators, and just taking, Connor and I had hundreds of meetings with people. I'd say every other day for a year and a half, we just tried to talk to as many people as possible and hear about the struggles and hear about the issues that they're having so that we can fix that or stop those from happening. And ultimately, it was really, two main areas of focus, which was simply the quality of testing, being able to send samples to a laboratory and trust the results. And when I say trust the results, I mean, make multi-million-dollar decisions on your production facilities, on your processes, on your workflows, and ultimately your production licenses to continue growing or continue producing. These had to be confident decisions, not a matter of getting a piece of paper from a laboratory and leaving that up to interpretation. It meant having the sparring partner at the table with you. And then secondly was the turnaround times. You find that, the sooner you can make those decisions, ideally, you'd want testing to be done every single day or as soon as possible. But we all know that it's difficult. It's difficult to have that luxury, right?
Yeah. You talk about turnaround times. It's just so funny here because, with all the production that's built up around Denmark, you think, what kind of access, there must be some kind of access here, in country to the producers of pharmaceutical cannabis. And, in turnaround times, they're looking at not only just getting their analysis back from the lab, but importing and exporting, their samples to different countries that are then getting dispersed to various labs. One lab might cover half the pharmacopoeia or might cover half the analysis required for the various testing they need. They might have to send to another lab to get the remainder of their analysis. So, the turnaround times where, you could say, or, really should be 3, 5, maybe 10 days, depending on what's getting done, could turn out to be 3, 5, 10 weeks where you have products, these producers have products sitting on the shelves waiting those results to then make those decisions off of.
Yeah. So, there's so much there, isn't there? Sort of time lags, unrealistic expectations, but clearly there was a market need that wasn't properly being served. And what I really like about you guys is you're like a pharmaceutical company that is specializing in cannabis rather than the other way around, which I think is what is needed to succeed in certainly the European medical cannabis industry.
Of course. And the team that we built was on the basis of what we were told is needed, right? So finding those academic sparring partners that had a background in industrial hemp research and medical cannabis research to identify and be able to spar with the customers. It's having the experts with decades of experience in pharmaceutical contract testing. So the ones that worked day to day on how you take a true pharmaceutical product through the value chain of production, formulation, and ultimate release into clinical trials and what have you. But it was then bringing, okay, we need that partner as well. We need the table of Quantum Labs to have all of the necessary resources. Then when we sit down with a customer, we already know their their weaknesses. We already know where they need help and can add that value before they even realize, because you realize also there's a lack of understanding, right? I mean, the regulators.
Well, the rules are being written, right?
Exactly.
They haven't been written yet.
Exactly. So it was in a typical pharmaceutical industry, you'd have a lot of people coming to you and saying, on the testing side, here's my product. Here's how I want it tested. Here's the method. Here's the requirements. Here you go. Whereas in the cannabis industry, I wouldn't even say it's the opposite. It's actually completely non-existent. You have customers asking, what do I need to do? Where do I need to test? When do I need to test? What needs to get tested for? And how do I get my product to market? So it's a little bit of this, super non-conventional approach. And that was something that we really had to hone in on and make sure you assemble a team that has those qualities that can help give that guidance.
Yeah. And so you've got a very good, strong science team, haven't you? How much are you working with regulators?
We work with them as much as we can. They're quite busy, as you can imagine.
But they must be learning as well, right?
Yes,
so
definitely. And so some of our staff, actually, one of our first hires was an analytical chemist, a PhD researcher from a local university who had been focused on natural products and working with industrial hemp, and then for quite a few years in country, and then started working with medicinal cannabis as the regulators started to put their ideas on the table of how to set up a framework. So she had actually spent some time working with them and consulting from the chemistry lens, right? How to get a monography in place that are interpretation of the European pharmacopoeia, and kind of how to, understand the value chain. So working with regulators as much as possible, as much as allowable, right? Ideally, what we see time and time again, and you can look at whether it's a state in the US, Canada, anywhere else in Europe, is that there is a huge lack of knowledge in setting those standards or producing those methodologies or authoring those methodologies in how to test, cannabis for XYZ, how to test this cannabis product for, for its cannabinoid content, for its, what's the limited detection on pesticides, for example. And so ideally what we're trying to do right now is, build out and optimize our own methods and then be able to, provide a good substantial foundation for those methods that the Danish government and the regulators, require cannabis-based products to be tested against. And a good example of that is the European pharmacopoeia, regulates pharmaceuticals here in Europe. And then, Denmark has their own edition or interpretation of it, the Danish monograph. And they tell you how a lab should prepare a sample. It might say, grind the cannabis flower and then, go on to the next step, right? But how do you grind that? And what kind of deviations or how can you alter the eventual results based on how you decide to grind that sample, right? These are kind of some of the aspects that
what the materials the grinder is made out of.
Sure, exactly.
Of course. And so these are kind of the aspects that we're hoping to bring to the table and kind of bring, up that level of education, help work with the regulators to, you could call it freedom of operate, but just bring more clarity to the table.
So there's real opportunity to lead here, isn't there?
And I think the opportunity lies in kind of understanding the role that quantum plays, right? I mean, we don't create products. We're not selling products. We're not putting anything on shelf. So it's kind of, going into it with the mindset that, we're not here to influence regulations or influence changes or standards for our own benefit, right? We're here as, we are on the side of regulators, of the regulatory body, to help them make the best decisions going forward, right? And I think that that's slowly starting now to come into play as we have more and more dialogues with be it the Danish Medicines Agency or be it broader regulations in other markets as well, as they understand that the laboratory is not a competitor against a regulator. They're there to reinforce on a fact basis, hey, this is the best way to move forward. And these are the best standards because we've proven out the ones that really are not sufficient. So, and I think that's an awesome point to.
Yeah, no. Really, I mean, the opportunity to help set the standards, I think, is a very exciting one. And we'll talk a bit about that in the general topic of testing in a minute. To sort of round it out around quantum, you guys have just completed a funding round relatively recently. How much fun was that?
It was a blast. No, it was actually, you know what it was? It was a great learning experience, because the conversations are very seldom that, you sit down with a cannabis specific investor of, whatever background, and then you tell them that actually we don't make any products. We don't sell any products. And then they kind of step back for a second and, really we're not in, call it the most attractive part of the industry as a testing lab, right? I mean, we are a consistent.
You guys make it sexy. You do.
Thanks to me. Try. But I think, going through the funding round, it was understanding that there's, imagine the funnel of investors. Everyone's a cannabis investor in the cannabis industry, and then slowly the funnel or that filter gets smaller and smaller and smaller before you realize that,
oh, there's so much money out there. Can't you just go find it somewhere?
Yeah, exactly.
The dry powder, it's unlimited almost. Billions of dollars.
And I think there was a lot of instances where I can say that, we sat back and said, okay, well, we can take a deal from this XYZ investor. They bring no strategic guidance. They bring really, the smart money. Having come from finance backgrounds, I think Connor and I, really quickly agreed so firmly on the fact that, okay, do we want to just go find money, or do we want to bring in money that would help guide us and help us kind of be that sparring partner for us around a broader, bigger picture, around testing labs and overall quality across markets and across global operations in the cannabis industry, not today, but in the future going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, probably the most common theme across the cannabis industry globally is like education, right? And to try and pitch or sell an investor on, what quantum, what our theory or thesis and hypothesis was and our vision for quantum really. I mean, we had to make make multiple pitches to get or inform that, whoever investor XYZ was sitting across the table from us to get them to understand what we were doing. Maybe they were a cannabis person, but from a different region. Maybe they were a life sciences person, but didn't understand cannabis. Maybe they understood one aspect of the value chain, but not, the contract analysis type. And so we found it very, very, actually, we probably didn't ever sit across the table from someone that already knew how the contract, testing analysis laboratory industry worked, while also knowing about, cannabis more or less on some level, while also being familiar with Europe, right? So we were always having to make multiple pitches and sells in, and at that point, investors get hundreds of decks a week, right? And at that point, there's like, most people are, this is a little there's a little too many layers to this onion than we might have the appetite for. So that was probably, I would say, the most difficult aspect was trying to find someone that was, we were already in the sweet spot of and didn't have to, make, a crazy multi-layered sale to at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a typical feature of an emerging industry. You're constantly having to educate and take people on a journey. And I guess one of the things about what you're doing is because it's, on the face of it, not the sexiest area, you probably have less people kind of going towards it, right?
Yeah. And I think the people that are going towards it, right? It's what direction is it, right? You kind of have to go back and sit down and say, okay, well, if you're building a laboratory, is it a true only pharmaceutical laboratory? Well, that's very dependent on what way the market's going, right? It's very dependent on where will the cannabis industry be in 5 years, 10 years, and what markets will we identify as, future markets? Because of course, our Danish operation will continue forever to be the flagship of new method development and method optimization and, R&D for new methods and new testing capabilities. However, obviously we plan to really build labs across Europe to identify those key clusters that, as Connor mentioned before, need access. If testing had no price, you'd want to be testing everything and anything you could every day, because you need to know exactly where you're going to be at that time of batch release. And there's so many things that can go, act as those variables in your day-to-day operations as you build a facility, as you go through strain selection to understand what is it exactly that you're planning to commercialize and what sets you apart, what makes you different. So, and I think we're seeing it a bit backwards now, because as companies reach the EU GMP validated product that is cleared, according to the Danish Medicines Agency for batch release outside of Denmark, really, now they're sitting back and saying, man, I wish we did more testing because our product doesn't, we wish we knew these characteristics that we're finding in the testing now 2 years ago, because maybe we would have gone for a different terpene profile. We would have gone for maybe a different cannabinoid content or, whatever it is that's defining your product. Those are the things that really you want to commercialize and help you stand out as a company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or just when the product producers need to approach the Danish Medicines Agency to, get a new product registered, right? The amount of data that they need to bring and show is quite cumbersome, right? And it's not like that point in time type data. It's not like when they bring this, big dossier or profile of the product that they would like to register to the Danish Medicines Agency and they show, okay, it's not like they got all that analysis done last week, right? I mean, this is, multiple cycles, multiple months, multiple years even of data that helps support why that product is stable, why its efficacy is correct and at the right levels and the right values. I mean, that's something that is becoming more and more, I think, understood in the pharmaceutical cannabis world that is Denmark right now, as Justin alluded to just earlier, is that, it's kind of like in the perfect world, you're testing early and often. You're just building the data profile of those products as you develop them going forward. That way, when you go to the regulators to register your product, you can show them, this is how you've been taking those risk assessments. You've been thinking about these various aspects. You've been proving out why did you decide to formulate your product that way? Or why did you decide to pick this strain versus that strain? Being able to show that out, and particularly with a chemical profile to back it up, is something that can go a long way in terms of, developing the right products, and then making sure in terms of, in terms of the strain or the profile of it, but then also in terms of the pharmaceutical stability of it.
Yeah, huge amounts there. Let's actually get into the kind of world of testing, and we've done a couple of shows on it, but it'd be good to kind of get the more pharma approach to it. What are some of the key types of testing that you're involved in? You mentioned pesticides before, but what are the sort of main ones in the cannabis industry that people need?
Yeah, sure. I think you could start basically from the most common or the most popular, which is simply just a cannabinoid content, right? Understanding what cannabinoids you have inside your product from called a chemical fingerprint, if you will. So, THC, CBD, and then really adhering to what maybe local regulations require. So according to the Danish government, you're identifying THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA, and CBN. So those 5 cannabinoids are required.
And so if you're testing for cannabinoid content, are you testing for specific cannabinoids, or will you list out all of the minor ones as well?
No, generally what you're going for is a targeted search. Right. So targeted meaning you're telling, in this case, liquid chromatography, so via, HPLC, what exactly it is that you're looking for on a potency perspective or quantitative, mass over mass equation. What are you looking for? And in doing so, then you would really identify the key cannabinoids that you're looking to quantify, and then it will then analyze for those. Okay. Very rarely will you have a non-targeted search because there's just so many elements. There's so much unknown about the minor cannabinoids and where they appear and how they appear. In that essence, it's more than a research study for one specific strain, let alone a data point. So cannabinoids being one of them. And then, as you look at the pharmacopoeia, you have to, you're of course mandated to search for heavy metals, pesticides, whether it be in flour or in extracts, residual solvents. You're looking at macroscopic, microscopic appearances, various microbials that could be present in the plant, and ultimately the moisture, because you have to avoid that, if the moisture levels are too high, could it, begin forming mildew or any kind of, mold. So there's a lot of a variety that's required by the pharmacopoeia. But I think, in our experience, the most important or most concerning is the cannabinoid profile, because that's, I think, in a way, the regulator's easiest means of putting a framework in place is to identify a cannabinoid profile or identify a product based on its chemical fingerprint. So, yeah.
Yeah, just to sum up, right? It's like it's looking at what the product actually is, and what its chemical profile is, and then for contamination as well. You could say in the product development process, we work mostly with the producers and just to understanding what the chemical fingerprint of that product is throughout various formulation steps that they've come back with. And then the contamination aspect is really more prominent just for getting those final products onto shelves, that quality control testing that the regulators deem necessary to get, various batches of final products released onto the market. So before, leading up to that final product registration, or when the producers are working on developing or formulating those products, really looking at that chemical profile or fingerprint in terms of cannabinoids, terpenes, etc. Microbial somewhat as well in terms of contamination, because that's, that involves in how well their process is.
Yeah.
But the contamination side of things, that's really just with getting those final products onto the shelves to make sure that they're safe for patients and consumers.
Yeah, I mean, we could characterize that under the bracket of quality control, let's say, where it's you need to attain a certain standard to be signed off by the regulator or whoever the competent authority is. On the other side of stuff, you're also doing stuff in the R&D space as well?
Exactly.
How more kind of tests are involved in that? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, as Connor alluded to, it's a lot of the early identification, right? So if you're going through an entire, let's say grow process for flower, it's, starting with the early on testing of a product in that first harvest. Now you've built this facility. You've gone through the process of investing all the money to build your grow operation. And it's then identifying, is this strain or this, specific cultivar that you plan on producing or commercializing, does it thrive so well in this facility? Does it have the same vigor that you'd hope for if you were to recreate that same facility somewhere else? So identifying that, okay, maybe you start with, 25 or 30 strains, individual cultivars that you're going through the process of saying, this one, the yield is, be it they could have the same cannabinoid content, right? Because you want to grow a 15% THC predominant strain, and in doing so, you then need to identify from a characteristics perspective what has the most resiliency, what is the most which of those specific strains, because they're all different. There's so many different characteristics that come into play when going through that strain selection. So when you mention R&D, it's a lot of early testing to learn what is it that exactly you're going to be commercializing in years to come, because you have to make that decision as early as possible. And we've seen it time and time again that you reach that right before commercialization and realize that, this strain is not what you had understood it to be, because maybe there wasn't enough testing, or maybe there's significant changes that have been made in your operations during the approval for production process, be it HVAC, be it your micronutrients in the water that you're feeding the plants. I mean, all of these things come into play that could have an impact on the resiliency or the commercialization of that specific strain. So as a lab, adding that value along the way.
And are you seeing clients become more sophisticated? I would imagine this is the type of thing that maybe earlier on in the industry, and maybe it still exists now, everyone kind of does at the end. And they're like, I've got to get the testing done. And then, whereas if you planned it and did it a bit earlier, you could avoid a lot of mistakes. Are you seeing this kind of evolution of behavior?
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
You definitely have new players jumping into the market that don't understand it off the bat. But I think one thing that's nice about being in a more regulated and pharmaceutical approach to a cannabis market here in Denmark, and I'm sure you saw this when you met a lot of the people in the industry, is that, a lot of the people that are working in the industry on the production side of things and just throughout the value chain, come from a pharmaceutical background, come from working at Novo Nordisk, come from working at, GSK, or all these other, very highly regulated production environments where, this is common practice. This is best practice, is to understand how to develop products in that form and in that fashion. So it is nice, I would say, here to be in an environment that is at that level.
Yeah, it must be very refreshing. And we kind of talked about it a bit before. There are already various tests that you're doing. Who sets the standards for those?
So when you look at standards that are set today, at least here in the Danish industry, and Connor mentioned it before, it's, you really ultimately have the World Health that puts out requirements for, let's say, natural products. That then is taken and derived into what would be known as the European pharmacopoeia. So natural products double click into Europe, and then they implement that into a EU-wide framework. It is then the responsibility of the local, call it medicines agency or regulators for natural product testing in the specific country to then go through the process of, one, translating it, because it's now being applied in a different language, in a different setting, in a different culture, and ultimately enforcing that. So when you look at the standards that are in place today, it is enforced and implemented by the Danish Medicines Agency here in Denmark. So they've gone through the process of translating it. But ultimately, what is it? Those standards are really what need to be, from a quantum point of view, really need to be challenged and, asked why. Can this be done better? Is using ethanol for an extraction process the best way possible? Should you be using methanol? Should you be using ethyl acetate? What are those chemicals that should be used, and why not? And I think it's an age-old industry where now you're taking the square peg and putting it in a round hole of testing for a plant product in a pharmaceutical setting. And there's just a disconnect, but it requires all parties to be around the table to have those discussions, right?
Yeah. And so the Danish Medicines Agency, they've published a monography, their interpretation of the European pharmacopoeia as applicable to the cannabis industry. And in that monography, it lists out what cannabis products need to get tested for, and it gives guidelines on how they should be tested for them. And how they should be tested for, that is the standard. Ideally that way, any laboratory that is conducting this test is doing it the same way. Because if they're doing it the same way, they should be able to get the same results.
Within deviation, of course,
out there should be able to get the same results.
Exactly.
But, kind of coming, touching back on that point before, right? This really should be quite detailed, right? So that there isn't really room for interpretation on how a laboratory should be receiving a cannabis sample and then analyzing it for its cannabinoid content, right? Ideally, you have every laboratory doing it the same way so that regardless of what the sample is, or if they're getting 5 versions of the same sample, they should be getting 5 of the same results, right? And that's something you hear time and time again is from a producer, I anonymized 5 samples of, the same product. I sent 3 to different labs, and then I sent 2 to the same lab, and all 5 came back with different THC contents, right? And, that you could say, you can point to a lot of different fingers, but particularly relevant to the standards set by, for example, the Danish Medicines Agency and the monography, it's that there's little this freedom to operate. And that was the grinding example I said earlier, where it might tell you in the sample preparation process, which is probably the most difficult aspect with cannabis because, bump, bruise, lose a trichome here, shimmy a trichome there, or, how you're grinding and something. I mean, that directly affects what you might, for that first sample you're getting in, how you prepare that sample to then load it onto an instrument to do that analysis. I mean, how you get from that point to that is going to completely change what the potential results or data that's coming out of the instrument that you loaded the sample into will come out as, right? And, I think that's also an aspect of, when we were learning about the industry and, why is it that current laboratories aren't servicing the cannabis, pharmaceutical cannabis production or any cannabis production really at that in a way that is, reliable and giving quality results. It's because, the laboratories that exist today, they're their own production site, right? Their business model is sample in, result out. How do I do it as low cost as possible and as high volume as possible? And that's really the way a lot of the labs are run, more or less. It's very, very production, like lean operation, production focused. You want to talk about the product that we just analyzed, fee. That's going to take time, or if we even pick up the phone. And so to really think about, okay, well, for this cannabis industry, you have these complex matrices with a lot of different compounds. It's not a typical pharmaceutical, one molecule, one drug. It's, a cannabis flower that is very complex. There's all these different molecules in it. Okay, well, how do we best, when we're a laboratory and we're looking at the regulations or the standards or the literature that's out there in the market that says, okay, well, we're starting to analyze for cannabis now. Okay, it just says grind the cannabis. Okay, well, we have a grinder. Let's use it. Okay, we'll get our results. But, understanding how to actually best run that sample through the preparation process to get the most reliable and consistent results time and time again. I mean, that's something that we are focusing the most on, particularly with cannabis, and dedicating ourselves to focusing on cannabis samples, where other laboratories don't really have the bandwidth or the dedication to really understand how they need to best optimize or how to best interpret the methodologies or the standards that are being given to them as guidance from the regulators.
Yeah, there's huge amounts there. I think the key takeaway is just the concept of consistency, and consistency seems to be the watchword in European medical cannabis industry. Well, that's quite a good segue, actually. One of the things you highlighted is the kind of hierarchy of where the rules come from, WHO at the top and going down. How much of a challenge is the lack of harmonization, the fact that it's sort of ultimately devolved to local competent authorities who are going to take a different interpretation? It's much talked about Germany and Denmark being at the very high end of the standards and, very strict in terms of how much variance versus other territories in Europe. How much of an issue is that lack of harmonization?
I wouldn't call it an issue as such as an inhibitor, right? Because if you think about it in its just most simplistic form, it's that you have different countries imposing different rules, some of which at its core just cost more money to do and they're more complex. And then identifying and really implementing how much sample goes to a laboratory. How much should we ask for? How much should the customer be sending us so that we can ensure from a 1 kilo to 100 kilo batch, what is homogeneous? What is a representative sample? So now putting those things into play, every step that you add or enforce at a country level becomes either more strenuous, more expensive, or simply just, harder for your local producers to adhere to. So you have to really think about from a production standpoint, it's the production that needs to be at the highest level possible so that there's a lab framework that it can all fit in. Because if you take a lab framework perspective and just throw it into a call it less structured cannabis framework or cannabis ecosystem, none of those producers are going to be able to adhere to the lab requirements. Yeah. So it's this give and take relationship where, yes, it's very much needed. And I think there's a lot of, push or support from local governments to implement frameworks. But to what extent it really needs to, I think we're going in the right direction to a harmonized pharmacopoeia, at least for the EU. but it is still a ways away. And it comes from everyone sitting around the table discussing the issues instead of hearing a lot about how everything's going great. We're producing, everything's going so well, but look, we're the laboratory. We hear everybody's, deepest, darkest secrets, and we're there to help. So sitting in a room to help everyone discuss, across the value chain is far and few between.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, we could talk about that for ages. So we're going to have to wrap it up now, but I mean, it's good that you guys are contributing to raising standards effectively, which is what is definitely needed in this space, and exciting times, guys. Thank you so much for joining me today and for also hosting me in Denmark.
It's finally great to have you here. It's been a much talked about event.
It's been a great little trip, and we look forward to hosting you back in London as well. So thank you, guys.
Awesome.
And thank you. Just want to give you a little shout as well. I mean, when we were getting into this, listening to the podcast was something that helped us, I feel like make leaps and bounds, really understanding different aspects of the value chain, hearing different stories from people and how they interpret the market. I think it was something that, more or less when we were shacked up in an office, grinding away on building a business plan and strategizing and trying to learn about the industry was something that kind of set us on the right path forward as well. So props to you.
We were crushing 2 episodes a day, one on the way to Odense, one on the way back to Copenhagen every day. So
thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. It's very nice.
Everything you do is great. So thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. Please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.